All right. Well, hopefully everyone can hear me. Thank you for either joining or listening into our webinar. My name is Dr. Janine Dominguez. I am a clinical psychologist in the Anxiety Disorder Center and part of our Selective Mutism service. And I'm also joined by Dr. Kathleen Aris, who is part of our Learning and Development Center, and she's going to lend us some expertise at the end, talking a little bit about requesting services through schools, since our talk today and part of our SM series is really about how to bring selective mutism treatment into a team approach and collaborating and coordinating with schools. So a little bit about what the outline it will be for today is really just giving a brief rundown of what selective mutism is and what we think is an effective treatment for SM, but really then focusing on how to bring this into the school setting where we know most kids who are diagnosed with SM are facing the most challenges, and how we can really foster a team approach with school staff and parents on how to really generalize gains to a setting where kids are mostly impaired. And then, as I mentioned before, just talking a little bit more in depth about school services and what an individualized education is and what a 504 is, and what the differences between those things are, and the proper way of sort of requesting for services when needed. That's usually a lot of the questions that we get from parents about how to formulate that process. And then if there are any questions at the end, we are certainly available to answer questions. So just a brief intro into selective mutism. So of course, starting off with the foundation of what the diagnosis of selective mutism is. So we're looking for symptoms that are persistent failure to speak in specific social situations when we would otherwise expect a kiddo to be speaking. So that's usually in the school setting or potentially extracurricular activities, on play dates, maybe with extended family members. And typically when the kiddo is in a comfortable situation like home, they're actually really chatty, have no difficulty verbalizing or communicating with people that they're most comfortable with. So it's kind of this really stark difference between being in a social setting where they might be potentially anxious versus at home when they're comfortable, and this failure to speak in those social situations. We usually start to see the impact of these symptoms when a child starts school. So we generally see kids who are starting preschool or kindergarten or first grade, just because you can really truly see the impact of the symptoms in their level of participation at school. And you can really see that it potentially interferes with their ability to garner the most that they can from that educational setting when they're not participating in a verbal way. And their lack of verbalization, we also want to rule out that it's not due to a communication disorder or a lack of knowledge or a discomfort with the language, but really that it's based in anxiety, where a child's feeling anxious and then unable or avoidant of verbalizing in those settings. And the other thing to keep in mind too is that we don't typically diagnose selective mutism within the first month of starting the school year, just because there is a typical adjustment period for kiddos who are first starting school or starting a new school year, where they might be more shy or more anxious, but typically that goes away within after the first month of adjustment. And so if symptoms seem to be persistent, then that's usually a flag for us that it might be just more than shyness or a typical adjustment period, but potentially more along the lines of selective mutism or social anxiety. So why we care about SM is just really because these kiddos are really suffering in silence, and SM is really relentless. So we usually ask people to try not to talk for a whole day, or even count how many people you talk to just today, and imagine not being able to do that, or really being avoidant of doing that. And if you think about a kiddo in a school setting, they spend a lot, if not a bulk of their time in school. And so if this is a place where they're nonverbal, it's really challenging and difficult then for a child to be able to participate like their peers. I think another important thing to go through is really understanding how we conceptualize selective mutism and the symptoms. And it's just like any other anxiety disorder, we really like to emphasize both nature and nurture. So really, these are kiddos who potentially have a genetic predisposition to being anxious. And you can usually tell that they have some inhibited stance when they're very young, even when they're around 18 months or 2 years old, where you can see that they're a bit more shy, or they're a bit more reticent to approach novel or different tasks. So there's certainly already sort of this predisposition to being anxious or avoidant of new things. And then there's the nurture side, where the environment might shape that inhibited stance. So ways in which maybe parents or other adults interact with the child that might enable some of that avoidant behavior. And so really that's part of our behavioral conceptualization when talking about selective mutism. And so I'm actually going to go through this cycle of how we conceptualize SM and how the symptoms do then become reinforced with the environment's role. So for example, a child's prompted to talk or engage in some way, even if it's behaviorally, we can see that the child gets too anxious, whether it's they freeze, or we can see just physically that they're anxious, and then they avoid either answering the question or engaging behaviorally because they're too anxious. An adult, whether it's a parent or a staff member in school, sees that the child's anxious, their level of anxiety actually raises, and so in order to lower the child's anxiety and the adult's anxiety, that adult usually rescues and either answers for the child or completely allows them to avoid doing the task in general, and then that really negatively reinforces the anxiety and also the avoidant behavior. So negative reinforcement in the sense that it's negative because it's taking away the child's anxiety and the adult's anxiety, and it's really reinforcing that inhibited stance or that avoidant behavior. So if you think about it, this cycle is constantly happening, potentially in a school setting where a child's anxious and nonverbal, and this is the cycle that we're hoping to prevent and hoping to avoid as well when it comes to treatment. So again, in these social settings where a child is nonverbal, it becomes very automatic to avoid being verbal or avoid engaging in a behavior that makes a child feel anxious. It's really rapid fire on a daily basis. So if you even think about when a child first enters like a classroom, they can sometimes be bombarded with a ton of questions like, how are you? How was your day? How was your weekend? Where do you want to sit? And if a child is typically nonverbal in these settings, those are all opportunities for them to avoid being verbal and kind of constantly have this loop happening. And enabling in general plays a role in maintaining this silence. So enabling in the sense that we're allowing a child to avoid being verbal in these settings and potentially not creating opportunities for them to be verbal. And lastly, when we think about children with selective mutism, we also think about multiple variables that might influence whether they're verbal or not. And these boundaries are really not fluid for kids with SM. So the three main variables that we think about are people, places, and activities. And for each child who has SM, there's unique variations to this. So there's been several kiddos that I've worked with where in the school setting they actually might be able to be verbal with a parent or someone else that they're comfortable with in the environment, but they're just nonverbal with people within that environment. And then there are other kids I've worked with where as soon as they cross the threshold of the school door, they become nonverbal completely, even with people that they're comfortable speaking with outside of the school setting. So each child, because of that variation and that uniqueness, each child might start at a different place when we're thinking about generalizing treatment to a school setting. But the goals remain similar in the sense that we're helping them to start at different points, but really take steps towards being able to talk with as many people and different places and within different activities, and just generalizing those gains. So in that vein, again, just reiterating that the goals for treatment are to have a child verbalize to more people across settings and activities. Oftentimes also what the behavioral treatment is doing is really helping the child to develop distress tolerance, but also helping adults around the child to develop that distress tolerance as well. So that way they're less likely to rescue when it's not needed. And especially here at Childmind, we're always thinking about how we can systematically move treatment from the therapist's office to generalizing it to real world settings where the child's symptoms are most impairing. So we often say it really it's great when we can get a child who's been nonverbal to be verbal with us, but then we're really thinking about how we can then help facilitate that in other areas and really getting them to be verbal within their world. So that nicely moves us into how we can create a team approach, specifically within a school setting, again, where these symptoms are most impairing. So the very first step, and often what is part of our recommendation when we're thinking about treatment for children who have SM, is building a foundation with the school and really starting with information around psychotherapy and being really transparent about what we're asking of the school, and also being transparent around what the difficulty is for your child. I think sometimes parents might be hesitant to share the diagnosis with the school or with a teacher or with staff, but really we've seen it be only beneficial if everybody at school that's interacting with your child is aware that they have an anxiety disorder, that they have the diagnosis of selective mutism, and really what that diagnosis is. So there are different ways in which you can start to create and build that foundation. One of those ways is, as you can see on this picture, is potentially putting together a letter that talks about your child, talks about selective mutism, and gives kind of a brief description of what SM is and what that looks like for your child, and also gives them ways in which they can interact with them, so that way it's giving them the most benefit in the classroom setting from the beginning. And within that letter too, you're also putting in different things about what your child likes to do and who they are and some of their favorites and some of their strengths. So that way we're also reminding teachers and staff that they're also a whole person, not just a person with selective mutism. And this letter can be sent out at the beginning of the school year. And I think with whether it's in a letter format or even an email, it just really helps to prep teachers and those who are going to be interacting with your child to know what to expect. And if we're also thinking about that, the behavioral conceptualization that I just went through and that loop, that cycle of avoidance, we're really not wanting to recreate that. So one of the first things we talk about is really placing no pressure on a child to be verbal in a social setting, especially when they first enter that social setting, because we also want to avoid avoidance, right? And we don't want to recreate that cycle or that rapid firing of negative reinforcement of questions being asked and them avoiding them, and then an adult rescuing, and that cycle continuing. So really one of the best things to do is really set up the stage for teachers and staff to not ask any questions in the beginning, and really helping them to understand what selective mutism is. I think because of those unique variations, sometimes people can be confused if they see a child be able to be verbal with their peers but then are nonverbal with teachers, or vice versa, where they're verbal with some teachers but not with all teachers or not with all staff, or maybe they're verbal with some staff but they're not verbal with their peers. And sometimes because of those unique variations, it can sometimes seem like a child is being willful or oppositional or deciding not to be verbal. And I think it's really helpful for everybody to be on the same page that it's not about oppositionality, but certainly about anxiety, and it's just hard for them to be verbal with everybody in all settings and all activities, and that's what we're helping them to do. So what can be included potentially in that email when you're first making contact with the school, or when you're getting your team in place to really help facilitate treatment in the school setting, is one, notifying kind of the teacher, potentially the school psychologist, the school counselor, the principal, and other maybe staff members that you want to put on this email, that your child's been diagnosed with selective mutism, what that is, and then really putting in maybe some of these tips that I've laid out here of what they can do for the child to sort of set up that stage. So some of the things are speaking in a calm and friendly voice. I know that sounds like it might be already something that the staff is doing, but it's always nice to sort of reframe that and also help them understand that any child with anxiety, when you're speaking to them in a calm and friendly voice and really modeling that can be really helpful. Removing all direct pressure to speak when first meeting the child. And that doesn't mean that you can't speak to the child. It just means that you're, instead of asking questions, you might be making more comments or observations of the things that they're doing, telling them that it's so nice to see them again, and that you're excited that they're here for the school day, and that there's a lot that's going to be planned. It's just avoiding questions in the beginning. And then it kind of goes through things that once a child's ready or they seem comfortable, being able to ask the child questions, but in a forced choice way, or an open-ended question. So a forced choice question being, do you want a red pen or a blue pen? Or an open-ended question just saying, what color pen would you like? And the reason we default to asking questions in those ways and avoiding yes-no questions is because with yes-no questions, a child's more likely to engage in a nonverbal response, like a head nod. And so presenting questions in these other ways just creates more opportunity for them to be verbal. Waiting 5 seconds for a child to respond to any question. So we're really helping them to develop that distress tolerance within those 5 seconds, and also building your distress tolerance, because it's the longest 5 seconds you'll wait, but it's also providing the child with an opportunity to answer verbally. If a child is verbal with a staff member, really helping them to understand to give them positive feedback and reflect what they said. So thank you for telling me that, or great job brave talking, or just really reflecting what the child said. So if they were like, I want a red pen, you want the red pen. Great, thanks for telling me. So that way they feel heard. We're also sort of giving them some tips about not accepting nonverbal responses, or please accepting nonverbal responses. So in the beginning, before we're really working on treatment goals at school, if a child is going to respond nonverbally, then we want to allow that to happen in the beginning until you're working with a child's therapist and it's part of the goal setting that we're not going to accept nonverbal responses, but we're going to expect some verbal responses. Then that might be the time to do that. But until then, you are accepting nonverbal responses and whispering as well. Not showing frustration or engaging in negative talk, saying things like, oh, why don't you talk to me? Or do you not like me? That only makes the child feel guilty, and also can continue to perpetuate the anxiety. Also for kids who have SM, saying things like hello, goodbye, thank you, please, all those the things that we would expect other kids to say and do. Those tend to be the hardest things for them to verbalize. So when they aren't saying hello or goodbye back, it's not them being rude, it's just really hard for them to say. So it's helpful for staff to understand that. And then until a child's actually ready to ask for things that they need, we're also asking staff to allow a child to either get up on their own to get a drink or go to the bathroom without asking necessarily, until we're working on that as a goal. So then the second step, once we've kind of disseminated some education around what selective mutism is and some tips of what staff members and teachers can do in the beginning, you're really helping to set up a time, hopefully with a therapist, or a bulk of our treatment too is really empowering parents to do this as well, is really helping them to learn the behavioral skills and the training needed to really facilitate some of the treatment there. So this is just kind of a rundown of what the behavioral skills are. So we always talk about child-directed interaction, or CDI, and this is the warm-up time for the child where there's no pressure, no questions are being asked, but we're really positively praising any sort of behavioral or verbal engagement. We're reflecting what the child has to say if they're being verbal, or we're just really describing what the child is doing, but with no pressure to speak. And then once the child is warmed up, and that is very different for each child, then you can move into VDI, or verbal directed interaction, where we're asking forced choice questions, open-ended questions, or directly asking a child to tell us something in a way where we're creating these opportunities for them to practice being verbal and practice their brave talking. And additionally, we're still praising them for their talking and reflecting what they have to say. And part of the behavioral skills and really providing a thorough training, usually we hope to secure like an hour or an hour and a half with staff and really detailing out what the skills are, but also making it really specific to the child, is really also helping staff to be comfortably uncomfortable. So really helping them to understand anxiety and also being okay with meeting a child where they are, and also helping them to push them along the way to not avoid doing the things that make them feel uncomfortable. So the do's and don'ts of selective mutism, this is just more of a resource for you guys to look through. And also if you've joined us for other selective mutism talks, these skills are much more in detailed in other talks, like building brave muscles or just SM 101. So I'm not going to go through this all, but sometimes you can also take this from our slides and share it with staff members or teachers, and it just gives you some examples of what the skills are, how to use them, and why we use them too. I think one of the most important things in sort of building this collaboration with the school is also potentially after a training or after a team meeting is identifying who your key player or key person is going to be at the school. And this is usually the person who is going to really take on the behavioral skills and really help this child generalize treatment in the school setting. So sometimes that's directly the teacher, sometimes it's the school counselor or the school psychologist, really whoever can spend at times one-on-one time providing the child with opportunity to practice their brave talking at school. And again, you're helping to pass on what we call the bravery baton. So if a child is yet not verbal with anybody in a school setting, brave talking practice might require a parent and a kiddo to go into the school where a child's just practicing brave talking with the parent in the school setting, and then we're slowly bringing in a staff member who's going to be the key person into that brave talking practice, and then eventually getting the child to be able to be verbal with that staff person. And then once they are verbal with that staff person and we're taking the parent out of the picture, then that person can go on to generalize those skills in the school setting as well. So the talking map is really, this is just one way of making a talking map, and this is an example of it. And a talking map is again, if we go back to the 3 variables that might influence where a child's verbal or not, we want to sort of see, you know, on the top row we see different environments, and going down the columns we see people, and we just maybe specifically for school we want to see where a child is verbal and with whom in different settings. So for example, for some children they might not be verbal at all in the school setting, and really treatment might start outside of the school, maybe in the playground or right outside the door, and really warming up a child with somebody they're comfortable with, and then moving into the school setting, and then eventually adding a staff member to that. Or for other kiddos, it might be that they can be verbal in the school setting in their classroom, but we're helping them practice brave talking during times where all the kids aren't in the classroom, and we're just having some one-on-one time with somebody that they're comfortable with, and then eventually adding in a staff person into that brave talking practice, and then eventually maybe adding peers, or then adding new other staff members to that, like the gym teacher, the art teacher, the music teacher. So really this talking map or this verbal map is a way for you to keep track of where your kiddo is making practice or progress, and where they need to continue to make progress as well. So this next slide is really just a way of what we call like fading in a person into your child's like verbal world. So it's a stepped process of potentially how to do a fade in process, and it details out exactly what I just talked about a bit, where a child might need to start off practicing in an empty classroom with no one else around, just with their parent, and really building up momentum. And then eventually having their teacher maybe come into the classroom and go off and do something else on their own, but just be in the classroom and not engaging with the parent or the child, and really having the parent continue to build on that verbal momentum with the child. And then once they are building that verbal momentum, really then helping the teacher get closer and closer to where the child's playing with the parent, and then eventually helping the parent transfer that verbalization to the teacher. And then the second part to a fade in is really then fading the parent out of the classroom, and just having the teacher and and your kiddo be verbal together. And once that's happening, then you can help the teacher or the key person generalize that to then more classroom time during school hours with other peers and with other staff members. But really the first step in this process is really identifying who that key person is, and really making sure that your child has a verbal relationship with that key person, and they're finding time to practice brave talking during the school time. So as I've been as I've been discussing, once you've made that first connection with that key person and your child's verbal with that person, you're really then trying to build on that momentum and finding a daily dose of treatment at school. So you really want to practice on a daily basis. If you think about, again, going back to that circle, where avoidance is really overlearned, then we really want to overlearn brave talking as well. And so in order to do that, it's really a daily dose of treatment. And so it's finding moments with that key person on a daily basis where they can practice brave talking in the school. And as we're talking about what to expect for a kiddo with SM in the classroom, I think this is when we talk a little bit about accommodating versus enabling. So accommodating or accommodations are really meeting the child where they are and understanding that at this moment they're unable to maybe do a presentation in front of the class, or they're really unable to ask to go to the bathroom. And so an accommodation is really setting them up for success, or giving them an opportunity to still participate, but participate in a way that they can do it, versus enabling, where we've now practiced with the child and they're verbal with the teacher and they're verbal to some of their peers, and now the next step in the goal process is for them to ask to go to the bathroom. Then we don't want to enable the anxiety if we know that that's the next step for them, and so we might expect that and have that be part of their goal for treatment. And so enabling would be not creating that opportunity or not pushing them to make progress when progress needs to be made. In terms of accommodations, some of the things, as and we'll later talk about 504 and IEPs and things that you might be requesting, but some of the accommodations that we often talk about with kids who have SM are potentially establishing nonverbal cues for safety. So until a child's ready to ask for these things, which is usually a higher order treatment goal, then we want to set up ways where a child can nonverbally either tell a teacher that they need to go to the bathroom, or that they want a snack, or they can't open something up, or that they have some sort of health issue like needing to go to the nurse. And so having all staff members be aware of what those nonverbal cues are is really helpful, so that way everybody understands where that kiddo is and what they're looking out for in terms of like these safety things. I think it's really scary for parents who have a child with SM just thinking about like, oh, what if my child gets hurt? They're not going to be able to say something to anybody. And so that's another reason why you're identifying a key person that you're establishing a relationship with at school that is a safety person. Or it might be a buddy system, as I have on another point here, where they're not going around the school building ever by themselves, but they're paired up with a buddy or a peer or somebody that they're really close with and they're really comfortable with, because that can also help to facilitate getting their needs met and they're not by themselves. Other accommodations is really building on their strengths or areas of interest, and what that really means is getting to know the kiddo, what they're really good at, and also helping them to do those things in the classroom. So, and getting them involved in the classroom in that way. So that way they feel a part of the class, and it's also helping them to feel included and also good about their participation, even if it's non-verbally in the beginning in the classroom. Other things that might be helpful too is normalizing and validating worries with the entire class. So sometimes kids who have SM, and I've actually heard patients tell me this, is that they don't want people to know or make a big deal about their selective mutism. And so sometimes having some education around normalizing worries and that everybody in class is working on something can be really helpful for a child with SM. Allowing for early arrival time and warm-up time. I think this is probably one of the more important accommodations that we usually ask for. So it would be wonderful if a kiddo can arrive at school a little bit early with a parent in the classroom and just have time to warm up with the parent and be verbal with that parent in the classroom. Or even have that warm up time also include that key person, that key staff person as well. So that way the child is getting that extra practice right before school starts, can really set them up for a successful verbal day for the rest of the time. Preferential seating, I think that can also be important, and that doesn't necessarily mean that a child needs to sit up front, but it does mean that it would be really helpful for either a child to sit close to the teacher, so that way the teacher can have an eye on that student and also be in proximity to that student, which only creates further opportunity for them to be verbal with the teacher. But it also might mean preferential seating in terms of peers. So certainly if there are peers in the classroom that a child is verbal with, it would be wonderful for them to sit next to that child, so that way they can continue to practice being verbal with their peers during classroom time. I talked a bit about the buddy system, and then the use of skills, that's also an accommodation. So really making it known that these are behavioral skills that staff members should really be utilizing, and really helping them to utilize those skills in the classroom would be really helpful. Other things to consider are, like again, when a child is unable to potentially participate in a group setting in the classroom, is maybe using videotaping. Videotaping is a way for them to maybe participate at home, record what they've done, and then either share it just with the teacher if that's where they are ready to share it, or maybe even potentially share it with the entire class. I've had patients do one or the other or both. The other way of doing this is actually providing small group opportunities for the student as well. So if they're not able to participate in front of the entire classroom, really creating a small group for them, so that way they can still participate in a group-like format, but it's smaller and doable for them. So that's another accommodation that could be made. Potentially some one-to-one support during key activities. So that might be activities, in a group setting as well. So a key person who the student is verbal with might be able to join in during these activities and help facilitate verbalization during those activities, or just one-to-one support throughout the day. So really, if a child's completely nonverbal, it might require one-to-one support with somebody that they're verbal with, so that way they're continuing to practice their brave talking. Part of the accommodations is also a transition plan for the next school year. So requesting, knowing who teachers are going to be, who they're going to be in a classroom with in terms of their peers, and also being able to go in before the school year starts, so that way they can practice brave talking before the school year starts, is also really helpful in terms of transitions. And then again, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but developing potentially a 504, requesting an IEP when needed. And I think that depends on level of severity in terms of the symptoms of your child and where they are in what they're able to do in the school. But I think it's also really helpful for you guys to know what that process is like. Also, constant communication, so somehow working on a daily back and forth. Weekly SSQs, so the selective school questionnaire, that's just a way for us to track symptoms. But you can also do this through just like weekly emails and team updates. There are multiple ways of doing it, but I think that the bottom line with this slide is really constant communication with parents, therapists, and the school staff that's working with your child is really important, so that way if there are stuck areas that we're able to address them head on, so that way not too much time goes by with them avoiding doing these things. And then I think lastly, just thinking about the next school year, a new setting can be a really amazing opportunity to build on momentum. So you really want to begin with building familiarity with the setting and with the teachers, coordinating visits, finding out who the teacher is, identifying some peers in the class, and really kind of setting up the foundation. Now is a great time to do that, so that way there's success in the transition for next year. And a new school setting and a new classroom can also be a great opportunity for them to continue to do more brave talking. And I think as we're approaching summer, it's also helpful to know that the summer can also be a chance to have your kiddo continue with brave talking in different ways, whether that means in camp settings or small group settings, really trying to bolster up more play dates or family vacations. These are all opportunities for you as parents to continue with the generalization in the community setting, and the more they practice that, the more that they're set up for the next school year as well. So I am going to turn this over, and Dr. Ayers is going to talk a little bit more about developing a 504 or potentially requesting an IEP through your school and what some of the procedures are, so that way if you're wanting to do that, you have some more information about how.
Okay. Hi, I want to provide parents with some information about going through this process because it often can seem very daunting and seem like a lot of information that parents and families don't really know where to start. So as Janine had outlined, there are a lot of accommodations that can be put in place for children, and it's really depending on what type of school environment that they're in and how open and willing that the teachers and the school staff are of putting these services into place will really determine if a 504 plan is needed or if a more formal IEP is required. So a 504 plan is an individualized plan for the child that alters or makes changes to a student's learning environment. So this is the type of services that can be offered in the classroom with some minor adjustments to the way that information is presented, or as we had mentioned, that the way in which a student learns, so preferential seating would be likely accommodated under a 504 plan. So this isn't removing them from the classroom. These are all services that can be put in place while they're still in the same learning environment. An IEP is a legal document that offers special education services, but that will either remove a child from their classroom or introduce additional services in the classroom that will accommodate their types of challenges. An IEP is required to have specific short and long-term goals that can be measurable over the course of the school year. So these include such services as counseling, specialized learning support, or services such as speech or occupational therapy. The process of obtaining an IEP, since it is a legal document, is somewhat formal and requires several different steps. A 504 plan can usually be obtained through communicating with the school and asking what they're willing to put in place. So the process for requesting an IEP involves several different steps that we have really nicely kind of combined into an acronym as a special process. So the first step is a screening process, and this is the step that parents or teachers have identified a particular challenge for their child. And then it is the parent's responsibility and to request a formal evaluation. So they do this through a written request to the chairperson of the school's district committee on special education. And the screening process will likely have some form of a standardized assessment such as an IQ, test or an academic measure, and then possibly some questionnaires for the teacher and the parents to complete. Within 60 days, it is legally required that the school respond to this written request, which then enters the preparation phase of the process. Upon the school's review of the request, the parents have the right to review and discuss this with the school. I think a lot of parents aren't aware of this step, and it's very important that they know that they have the right to discuss what types of assessments will be administered, as well as what the process is and any questions or concerns that they have. They can discuss this with the school. The evaluation that then occurs is really meant to highlight a student's strengths and weaknesses, as well as determine any services or accommodations that the child may need. They do this through a process that includes a detailed history and social history of both the child and the family. They also complete a psychological evaluation, so looking at a child's mood and behavior. Most evaluations will also include a classroom classroom observation and a speech-language assessment that is typically performed by a speech-language pathologist. All of these different assessments will then be included in the report that the school will provide to you, and they will be used to determine a child's eligibility for an IEP. Parents, as well as teachers, districts, representatives, will all be invited to sit in on a conference to speak about the child's eligibility. And if the school district has found that a child is eligible for an IEP, the student will then be classified on the IEP. So many of the different classifications that you may hear about are other health impairment, emotional disturbance, speech-language disability, or speech or language impairment. These are very common classifications for students to fall under, and these classifications are meant to provide services to the student. You have the right as a parent to obtain an independent evaluation if you do not agree with the evaluation that was provided by the Department of Education. And in this manner, you would seek out a private assessment, and then the results of that assessment would then be provided to the school district. Within 60 days of determining a child's eligibility, the team will meet, and the team includes, again, the parents, the school professionals, teachers, and determine specific short and long-term goals for the student. So during this meeting, and some of the requirements of the IEP will be the child's current abilities, their needs, and the evaluation results. So these should all be documented in the IEP. It would also include the goals for the year and how often those goals are going to be measured, as well as how frequent the services are going to be provided in order to obtain those goals. Also included in the IEP will be testing accommodations or any other sorts of accommodations or interventions that the Department of Education has found that the child would benefit from. Another important part for parents to know about is that you don't have to sign the IEP immediately. You absolutely have the ability to bring it home, to review it, possibly speak to other professionals about it, and then return the IEP to the school once you feel like you have accepted it. Okay, and then the last step, or somewhat last step, is the accommodations versus interventions, and I'll speak about this a little bit more on the next slide. But accommodations, as I mentioned before, are just changes in the way that the information is presented to a child, while the interventions supplement the way that this information is taught. So it really is a difference between keeping a child in their environment and adjusting some environmental factors versus interventions when they're getting pulled out of the classroom or additional support is being added into that learning environment. Finally, the last step is to review the IEP, and this is, again, a legal document, so schools are required to review the individualized education plan at least once a year, and they're required to reevaluate the student every 3 years. The purpose of this is to better understand how much that the student has progressed on their goals, if they're still requiring services, and essentially if the academic environment is the correct one for the student and if they need additional services or to be in a different type of school placement. So we already spoke about a lot of accommodations versus interventions, but I just wanted to provide some ideas and some examples of the differences between them so that parents can have a very clear idea of what types of services would fall under each. And if you're unsure of if something is an accommodation or an intervention, the best way to really determine this would be to speak with the school, see what they would be willing to offer to your child, and if they are able to do this under just a 504 or if they would need more of a formal evaluation and a legal document to provide this.
Wonderful. So I think one of the things to just tie it back specifically to the interventions that we're asking for SM, I think sometimes what makes it tricky is that every school is a little bit different in this process, and so I've certainly worked with patients where even if they were being pulled out of the classroom setting to work on some brave talking, that they were able to do that just with having a 504, and then there have been other schools where they've required more of a formal IEP process. So I think, as Kathleen talked about, it is really helpful just to be going back to like the very first step in creating a collaborative relationship with the school is really asking and sitting down with the child study team at the school, telling them what the difficulties are and what the therapist or what you're asking for them to do at the school, and really finding out what the process will be for them in order to get that started. And then you guys have these slides to really help you know what your rights are as parents and what you're able to request and how to request it, so that way schools are able to provide you with the accommodations that are needed. And then lastly, this last slide is just some helpful resources for you guys to have in terms just of information and access, and also just sharing some of these series with schools and staff, and just educating people about selective mutism and sort of what the treatment requires is also really helpful, and really connecting. I think another really huge benefit with some of these resources is also connecting with other parents that have children with SM that have also gone through this school process, and really forming a team can also be really helpful in getting other ideas as well. So I thank you guys for listening and really being a part of this series, and I hope that you guys also join us for our next talk, which will be Hear Our Voices, where we have a panel of children who either continue to have the diagnosis of SM or have had the diagnosis of SM, and they talk about their experience with treatment and what they've gone through, and really it's an opportunity to truly hear their voice. So I thank you, and have a good rest of the day.